Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence branch of the American Association of University Women and one of the civic partners for this show. Today our guest is Steve Todd. Steve is the BOCES Superintendent for Jefferson-Lewis and several other counties. Yes. So Steve, welcome back to North Country Matters. You've been a regular since 2013. We've had you on at least once a year, so it's great to have you back.
I always enjoy coming back, so thank you for having me.
Well, as I mentioned, you're the Jeff-Lewis BOCES Superintendent. You oversee 18 component school districts, and your district not only covers a lot of territory, but it has a wide range of types of schools, doesn't it?
From our largest schools, Indian River and Watertown, which are about 4,000 students, K-12, to our smallest school, Inlet Common School, which is almost a one-room schoolhouse, really, when you get right down to it, in Hamilton County, with about 30 students, and everything in between.
Right, and there aren't very many common school districts left in New York State, are there?
I think there's just a handful in
the
state.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to follow up with you, Steve, you were a member of the anti-poverty task force that Watertown has been working on for the last year or so. It was funded by a $1 million grant from New York State in the last fiscal year, and it was one of several pilot projects. So we recently did a North Country Matters show with Ann Adams, who I think you remember from your days here in this BOCES district. Ann is the retired superintendent from Herman DeKalb, and she's been doing a series of workshops with schools and teachers about what poverty looks like, so that from the teacher point of view they can understand what the students are going through. So talk to us a little bit about what the Watertown Initiative is doing. You sat on the education task force.
Sure.
Will that help to address student poverty, and is there an education component to it?
There is, and it's a multi-pronged effort, a multi-pronged approach. Ann's effort is not formally part of that ESPRI or anti-poverty $1 million grant that Watertown received, but it's a critical part of our educational outreach and effort. But certainly the ESPRI effort that you spoke of, Peter Schmidt, who headed that up, along with Bob Gorman at the United Way. I was honored to be a part of the large task force that oversaw that, and then the small education task force that worked on that issue. Number of very exciting initiatives that have been all now approved by the state of New York for implementation. Watertown was the last to be granted and the first to be fully approved. So that group really moved quickly and efficiently to put an effective plan in place that will address transportation and housing and opportunities for people who are living in chronic poverty to find ways out. There's a great program that the Watertown Urban Mission and the Community Action Planning Council are partnering on called Bridges Out of Poverty. That's just exciting. But on the education side, there was a piece that was funded as well by the ESPRI initiative, and that was to hold a forum at Jefferson Community College, very similar to one that was held very recently here at St. Lawrence University. So the first was held at JCC, and it went so well that the follow-up one, which I understand went exceptionally well also here at St. Lawrence University, was held, bringing stakeholders, not only from education, but from a variety of community agencies that try to serve folks in poverty and try to work together to discuss what they all do, what we could all do to realize the benefits of synergy so that we're not duplicating efforts, and it's powerful. So that effort actually was coordinated by Don Mezeboff, and I'm sure you know Don. He's a native of the North Country and lives right here in the Potsdam area, and a good friend of ours and a great friend to education. And Don has, over the last few years, been spearheading a poverty initiative, not just poverty, but poverty and trauma, because many of the negative side effects that one sees for students who have experienced chronic poverty are similar to those that a student of any socioeconomic background who has experienced a traumatic experience would feel, and that the responses that educators and other community partners would want to bring to bear would benefit students, whether it's strictly a question of poverty or it's a question of some sort of traumatic effort. So Don is working to bring these community conversations together, and that's been helpful. But also, there are individual efforts in several districts that are going on where teams of teachers and administrators are working to develop strategies internally. Watertown City School District and Copenhagen Central School District in my region have been very active in this. Here in St. Lawrence County, Colton Pierpont Central has been very active, and up in Franklin County, I believe Tupper Lake and Malone have been involved. So there are efforts afoot that are not exclusive to the Watertown effort, but are North Country wide that have been very powerful.
And part of the thing that we know about poverty in the North Country is that it's generational in many cases. Students who may be in school now, it's perhaps the poverty in their family started with their grandparents. So you don't have good role models, you don't have good family experiences for pathways out. So creating those pathways through these kinds of projects is critical. And we also know that how poverty presents itself in an urban area, perhaps like Watertown, is going to be very different than a rural setting like Colton-Pierpont. So having these kinds of programs that are community specific are very critical, aren't they?
I agree, and there is a good deal of hope too. I mean, sometimes we come together and we look at a situation and we throw our hands up and say, oh my goodness, the problem is so large, how can we ever begin to make a dent in it? And it's by making these individual efforts, multi-pronged efforts from many, many partners together. And the greatest hope, I think, comes in what we're learning from brain research. I mean, the neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain basically to change. And that if the right interventions are brought to bear, even though chronic poverty can cause, the negative side of the neuroplasticity, that the brain is developed in a direction that is impeding learning, you can reverse that and move it in the other direction by using effective strategies. And so educators are really deeply digging into the research of people like Eric Jensen, who's done a significant amount of work. Teaching with Poverty in Mind is his most famous work, and a variety of others. One of Don Mezeboff's colleagues has been working as part of his team there as well to make sure that's an important part of his efforts with the districts.
And one of the things we see at the community level is we know how important good daycare is. Before kids ever get to school, we know how important early literacy and exposure to literature is, and that's where public libraries can have a big impact as well as to help develop these kinds of programs. So you're right, it is a multi-pronged, and one of the things that I think makes it effective is that we learn that no one has to carry the water all by themselves. There's many, many people that can help, and many institutions that we have right here already that can be part of this when they start thinking about how they fit into the puzzle.
Hey, that's the truth. Complex problems need complex solutions and many partners. None of us can do it alone.
Well, speaking of complex problems, the New York State budget was just recently finalized, actually on time before the April 1st deadline. There's an additional $1 billion, which is a B, for money that has in the state budget in new educational funding. And some of the funding has come as a result of reforming some of the kind of antiquated funding formulas that we've had in this state. What impact will this new money and the new formulas have here in our North Country schools, Steve?
So I've analyzed my 18 districts' aid runs, and I can say that the first set of aid runs that came out when the governor had his proposal on the table before the Assembly and the Senate weighed in the negotiations called for about $338 million in new money through the foundation aid formula. And that was not nearly enough. Many of our districts were beginning sort of worst case scenario projections, and their initial budget building was based upon presumptions that would have called for some cuts based upon that initial offer by the governor. But thankfully the negotiations process brought the increase. It was just shy of $1 billion in total new money for education, but the part of that goes into foundation aid was just over $600 million. I think maybe 618 million. So that's almost twice as much as what the governor proposed, and that played out quite nicely for our districts. None of them are going to get rich, none of them are probably going to be expanding, but it allowed everyone to take a breath and say, okay, we don't have to go with the worst case scenario assumptions. We are likely not going to have to make cuts, and we can move forward. So there was good news in there.
And this is after years and years and years of cuts, which have only started to be reversed in the last couple of budget years. So that's important. One of the things I want to talk to you about is, on the funding reform side, is that students are still kind of prisoners of their zip code when it comes to educational funding. Is there any funding fairness and equity being brought to bear in this budget, or is this still a long road to go before we get where we've got some equalization between the high property value districts down in the suburbs and in wealthier areas and kind of our poverty-stricken North Country.
Yeah, I am, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. So I'll tell you, Donna, I am hopeful that we will find a day, and it'll be during my career and my lifetime, when we truly will address that, that problem. The reality is that for it to happen, one of two things is going to have to happen. Either a dramatic increase in the amount of money that's poured into education, which I think is probably not likely, or those who are receiving some of those resources are going to have to voluntarily, through the political process, agree to redistribute it. And that is almost more unlikely, I think, considering the political process. Folks in more affluent parts of the state who hold a considerable amount of political influence in the Assembly and the Senate are going to have to disappoint their own constituents and say, we need to redistribute, we need the formulas to be done differently. It's a challenge. And so the optimist in me and the realist in me battle on this. But I would say that we do an incredible job here in the North Country of stretching our dollars, getting more out of our scarce resources than perhaps any place else. So even though we may never be at a place where the spending per student is as high as it is, say, in Westchester or in parts of Long Island and other more affluent areas, we are able to provide our kids, I think, with a remarkable quality of education, considering the amount of constraint that we face there. We will continue to lobby vigorously and aggressively for reforms. I think in some cases there are attempts to try and help with that might actually be counterproductive. And one example would be the governor insisted that there be a new reporting mechanism in the process this year, with the stated goal of trying to ensure that there be greater equity. What that new reporting mechanism will do is it will essentially say to this first year, the 75 largest school districts in the state, any district that has 4 or more buildings and receives at least 50% of their funding from state aid will be required in year 1 to complete this new reporting, and then over the course of the next 3 years all districts will. But that only looks at inside the district. It doesn't look at the disparities between districts. And it's based upon the premise, I think, that many believe that there are places where some districts are spending more money in one building than they are in another. I don't believe that's the case anywhere here in the North Country. We do have districts that are going to be subject to that new reporting this year. In my region, Watertown, Carthage, and Indian River certainly will, based upon their size. My worry about that is it's another level of reporting that takes educators away from the work that they need to be doing to fill out paperwork. A second concern I have was voiced by Commissioner Elia, the New York State Education Commissioner, earlier this week, and I think correctly so, that it duplicates a report that already is being developed by the State Education Department under its new Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, legislation. So unless there is some way for those two new reporting requirements to be brought together into one common sense report, I worry that it's going to create sort of a proliferation of reporting, which is not particularly helpful.
Right. Well, one of the things that we know that is particularly effective here in the North Country is what a great service the BOCES system itself provides to its component school districts in terms of being able to help leverage that money the most effectively between districts, so that somebody who can't afford something can get that service through BOCES where they can't go to their local taxpayers. So that's a very good thing that we make good use of here, isn't it?
I think because of the scarcity of our resources and our realization that if we are going to provide our kids with what they want and what they need, we have to partner. We do partner more. And through BOCES, that's a perfect opportunity to do it, but it's not exclusively through BOCES. Our municipalities and our school districts partner in a wide variety of ways. BOCES certainly is the classic example of it. And I'm very pleased that in St. Lawrence, Jefferson-Lewis counties, we have some of the highest participation rates in BOCES programs in the state, because districts realize if they're going to stretch their scarce dollars, they really need to. Betty Rosa, the Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, was here in the North Country for a visit just about a year ago, and I had a chance to chat with her informally. It was at St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES, actually in Canton, and she had visited a couple of component districts here in St. Lawrence County, and she said to me, I am just amazed. You people up here share your toys better than any place in the state. And so that's my new, I may make that our mission statement actually. I'm going to change it and say, we share our toys.
Well, and of course, the truth is that the whole BOCES concept got started right here in St. Lawrence County many years ago for that very reason. So we should know how to do it the best because we've been doing it the longest. So, state testing has started.
Yes.
Here in New York State. The first set of the tests, which is going on this week and next, are English language, correct? And then next month will be the math component. So there's, it's interesting because this year's crop of fourth graders is actually, they were actually pre-K students when Common Core got started.
That's
so
right.
we'll finally have a component of students who had been exposed to these new concepts and these new teaching methods now to the point where we're starting to be able to test how well and how successful these teaching methods are, don't we?
I think so, and I'll be eager to see that. The only disadvantage we have in that, and there's a plus and a minus to it. I'm pleased, very pleased with the changes the State Education Department has made in the testing system, listening to concerns in the field. Commissioner Elia and the Board of Regents, I think, did a remarkable job of listening to those concerns. They've shortened the testing from 3 days to 2 days for each of the ELA and the math test. They've removed the time limit so that students can have whatever time they need. And it's not a question of how fast you can do the work. It's just show us what you can do. And they've done an exceptional job, I think, of involving educators in the development and the vetting and the creation of all of these tests. All very good things. But because changes have been made, it makes longitudinal comparisons a little trickier.
Yeah.
So we'll always look at those things and we'll always try to make the best comparisons we can, but until we have apples to apples from year to year, it's a little bit harder to do that.
Right. One of the things that we've seen in previous years were in some places there was a lot of opting out by parents to the test. That seems to be decreased this year, and in fact there's been kind of a statewide push to say yes to the test. What are you seeing in your districts in terms of opting out? Is it less than it has been in previous years?
Yeah, I only have anecdotal information, but my districts are telling me so far they're seeing fewer students opting out. So it's early on, and I think it's because perhaps, and I'm hopeful this is why, people realize that they've been heard and that the State Education Department has listened and implemented it. And if there are further concerns, there are really good channels for getting those concerns shared forward and then implemented.
And it's really important to remind people that the point of the test is to measure growth and learning, and you've got to have some mechanism to do that. It can't just go by the end of the year and say, you know, everything's all good and everybody gets passed along, and maybe they aren't getting passed along without those skill sets that they need to be successful. And we know from a lot of testing and a lot of research that when you miss key skills in the earlier grades, those deficits don't go away in the higher grades, do they? Yeah. So, well, Steve, I don't have to tell you that this has been a kind of a stressful year for students, parents, and educators.
Yes, it has.
Not to mention law enforcement when it comes to school safety issues and the attention that's been brought to bear on those ever since the Parkland shooting. One of the responses has been to take a fresh look at school resource officers, and in fact, here in St. Lawrence County, Canton Central has put that in their budget. Potsdam's looking at putting it in their budget. What's going on in your region in terms of school resource officers? You actually have some history with that because they have been present in some of your buildings in previous times.
Absolutely. So 15 years ago, there were quite a few school resource officers in the schools of the North Country because there was grant money from the federal government through the state that allowed 200 state police officers to be in schools around the state, and many North Country schools were blessed to have excellent state police officers in the schools. That program ended a few years ago as money became tighter. So the number of school resource officers in our part of the state declined dramatically. A few of my districts did sustain it by finding funding of their own and partnering with their own local agencies. Watertown City School District maintained a school resource officer through the city police department. That was an outstanding program. I was a teacher and assistant principal and principal there during the time when an outstanding officer was there. And it's a different officer now who's doing a great job too. It's a long-standing relationship and partnership and a great thing. A couple of other districts have had partnerships with the county sheriff's department as well. And we actually at Jefferson-Lewis BOCES have been in conversations with Sheriff O'Neill at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department about having a resource officer on our campus. And that's been about an 18-month conversation that is going to come to fruition this summer. We will indeed have a resource officer that we will fund the cost of it, but it will be an armed, uniformed officer, sheriff's deputy, and that is the model that many have used. I know there's an interest in many other districts if a funding strategy can be brought to bear that makes it affordable.
And I think it's important to remind people that although these officers are in the schools, they are not school employees, are they? They're actually the funding comes from you, but they actually are trained police officers who have a home base within a local policing unit, right?
There actually are, though, districts that employ their own retired police officers, and that's becoming a very popular model as well. Two of my districts, Carthage and General Brown, have retired state police officers who were, during the previous days I mentioned, school resource officers there when they were active duty state policemen, now are retired. They are employed by the district, and they are able to serve essentially deputized by the local police agency, but serving as an employee of the district.
Right. But they are very highly trained police officers with years of experience.
Very much so.
And I think that would help to allay a few fears about an armed person in a district maybe who doesn't have that good policing background.
I agree.
Because there's always that fear, I think.
Yes.
One of the things that we've talked about before are some of the innovative ways your BOCES is helping provide mental health and health services to students in your region. Given the stresses that students are under, not just from issues like poverty and as we spoke of before, but also kind of this feeling that schools may not be safe spaces, even though they actually are safe spaces when you look at the overall statistics. It doesn't take very many high-profile events to make people really start thinking about mental health issues and safety issues, does it?
That's the truth, and we're not alone in grappling with this. Every month, the 37 district superintendents from around the state meet with Commissioner Elia, and at last month's meeting, Commissioner Elia invited Commissioner Sullivan, Ann Sullivan, who was the Commissioner of Mental Health, to join us, and we had a wonderful conversation for about an hour and a half with the district superintendents and the two commissioners together about ways to partner. Commissioner Sullivan highlighted some of our work in Jefferson County as sort of an exemplar, and we were gratified by that because we've seen it working. It's only, like I said, multi-pronged. It's a complex issue. It's going to take a complex series of solutions. But I think our partnership with the St. Lawrence Psychiatric Center, which is part of the Office of Mental Health under Commissioner Sullivan's direction, that clinic that they opened on our campus continues to serve 85 students, which is not all of the students who need help, but it's 85 students who didn't have help before. We also have really increased our partnership with our local community service boards. The directors of those boards in Jefferson and Lewis counties met with our superintendents at our last meeting 3 weeks ago and strategized about ways to partner further and to make everyone aware of all the options that are available. The Children's Home of Jefferson County, which has a variety of programs available, including a respite program for students who have a mental health crisis, came and joined us as well. And they have a 24-hour hotline that they were able to let the districts know about, so that more and more of these partnerships and resources are being brought to bear so that districts and our community agencies are partnering together. And we are, in partnership with St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES, sponsoring a mental health symposium this summer. Main target audience is school district personnel, but we're also going to bring in representatives from all of the agencies that either directly or indirectly relate to mental health services. Likely we're going to hold it in Alexandria Bay at the Edgewood Resort, and it'll be a 2-day event. We're looking at probably July 24 and 25 with a keynote and then breakout sessions, and then perhaps the most powerful part will be sort of a provider fair where all of the various agencies and providers can interact, can share information with the districts, with one another, and then strategize and find ways to say where are the synergies that exist between us so that we're not duplicating efforts. There's too much work to be done for us to duplicate.
Right, and one of the things that we know in the North Country is that there's a real lack of services that we already know we need, and particularly when it comes to young people, and that's when we can head off problems.
That's right.
Before they ever get started. I was very interested a couple of years ago. Jefferson County did a mapping project where they actually mapped all of the mental health services that were there, and what they discovered was they had some places where there were overlaps and gaps, and perhaps by rearranging services you can fill one need and not make sure you've got duplication in another, and then adding in the kind of work that you're talking about doing to make sure that schools know who's out there, who's available, and what the services are, is a critical piece of that, because they are seeing things probably before anybody else sees things in terms of classroom behavior and issues in families and stress.
Absolutely, and what we've found is we can't presume that because we had a conversation 3 or 4 years ago and made each other aware of what's out there, that everybody necessarily automatically will know that, because there is constant turnover both in the agencies and in the districts. Among my 18 districts, I've got 8 new superintendents in the last 3 years. And I think that's common around the state. That's pretty much the trend.
And not everybody comes from within the area, so they're not going to be as familiar with the services that are available.
That's right.
I always like to say about the North Country, we're resource rich and information poor. We don't know what we have, and when we overcome that barrier, we can really start to move forward, whether it's on poverty or health issues or any of these other kinds of things.
That's right.
One other thing I want to touch base with you, Steve. We've talked the last couple of times you've been here about that exciting solar energy project that your BOCES has been spearheading among component districts and municipalities. We're almost at the start of the spring construction season, if it would warm up just a little bit more. So tell us how that project's going. You did some groundbreaking last year.
Yes, I'm happy to report that the first 12-acre array was completed in December, and the switch was flipped on just before New Year's. It's been producing power now since December 31st.
Now that's on your campus?
That's on our campus.
Right.
2 6-acre plots, and it's exciting. Now, obviously, January, February, March, not the optimal time of year to start producing power.
They have not been.
But nonetheless, power is being produced. Right. It's a 2.5 megawatt system, and we estimate that even if none of the other proposed arrays are built, and we think it could be as many as 12 similarly sized arrays over the course of the next few years, even if that's the only one that gets built, that it would save the 28 partners, municipal and school partners in the consortium, as much as $150,000 a year. So that's real money.
That is real money.
So we're excited that we're off and running.
Yeah, and so is there any reason to think that some of those other arrays won't start getting built this spring?
Much of it depends upon doing feasibility studies in various sites. Some are further along than others. The developers that we are working with have plans that have to be reviewed. Have to work closely with with National Grid on the interconnection, and so there are a variety of hurdles that need to be cleared for each of them. It's quite a cumbersome process. So we were so pleased to get the first one up and running.
Yeah.
And I think if we can get a few more, maybe several more finished, that it will multiply the financial savings for
once people really get a feel for what can be generated and what kind of a positive impact that's going to have on bottom lines, and that's a way to leverage scarce resource dollars, isn't it? By not writing big checks to National Grid as a school district, you can put that money into something else.
That's right.
It's more beneficial in the classroom.
That's right.
So as we wrap up, any last minute things? You got anything exciting coming up this spring, or is it just business as usual as you march towards graduation and the end of the school year?
We're excited actually that we just a few weeks ago got overwhelming approval from the voters of our supervisory district, 454 to 27, to do our first capital project in 50 years on our facilities. Our instructional buildings were in great need of electrical, ventilation, other upgrades just to bring the systems up to current standards, and security. Making sure that we have the types of security provisions in our physical spaces that many of our component districts have. A few roofs, some doors, some windows. No change to our footprint, but a $20 million project will do a lot of good in our instructional buildings, and we're grateful to our voters for that, and we're excited that that's that's the first project that's been done since our 2 tech centers were built in the late 60s.
Okay, so it is more, you know, as any homeowner knows, you have to do maintenance.
That's
And
right,
you have to
that's
do
right.
upgrades as they
That's
come
right.
along. Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming down today and for giving us this update. It sounds like there's a lot of exciting things that are happening and a lot of exciting things that will be happening. So we'll look forward to touching base with you again and, you know, doing some follow-up on some of the things that we've talked about today.
Excellent. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you. So our time is up. These conversations are a production of North Country Matters, which is filmed here in the Fred W. Cleveland Computer Center of the Potsdam Public Library. This show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country Matters. Steve, thanks so much.
Thank you. That was fun.
Great conversation.
It's always fun.
Yes.
As
great
always, we
conversation.
probably could have talked for 2 hours.
I think so.